You're about to hear history. This is the very first time I did Alienating the Audience as a segment on my old show, with none other than Tim Sandefur, who I brought back as my first guest on Alienating the Audience as its very own proper podcast. We had a fantastic conversation about Star Trek, hinging on Tim's thesis, which I won't even explain to you. You're going to hear it in a second. It's fantastic. Enjoy. Tim Sandefur is the author of Frederick Douglass, Self-Made Man. He's the vice president for litigation at the Goldwater Institute, adjunct scholar at Cato, former lead counsel of the Pacific Legal Foundation, Archduke of Prussia, member of every society you can think of. He's a very, very smart man. I've known him for a few years, and we're going to talk about Star Trek today, and I am so stoked to do so. Tim, thank you for joining me. You and I are here to talk about Star Trek, and specifically, I guess as a jumping off point, I read an article that you wrote for, I think it was the Claremont Review, and it was kind of using Star Trek as a chart of the decline of liberalism in America, for lack of a better metaphor. And one of the things that I really enjoy doing on this podcast is I like getting into not what people think and not what policies we're doing or who's right and who's wrong, or I should rephrase this, which tribe is best and which tribe is bad. I don't like tribalism. I really like getting into how people think. And so I enjoyed your article because it was this deep dive into the underlying philosophy behind Star Trek that's been underwriting Star Trek. And my takeaway from it was that you see a kind of gradual eroding of the initial Gene Roddenberry political morality, which was this Cold War liberalism where there's a right and a wrong. And the Enterprise is going around the galaxy encountering and combating tyranny and totalitarianism. And then we get to the next generation, and we have a much more touchy-feely Captain Picard who is more about peace and non-intervention and relativism. And
that's right. The rise of cultural relativism is really the distinction there.
So I'll kick it off with this question. You mentioned in the article, you described the Roddenberry folks as liberal technocrats and Cold Warriors.
Well, they're post-World War II liberals. These are often, many of them, actual veterans of World War II, including Jimmy Doohan, who played Scotty on Star Trek, who lost a finger on D-Day. And they had gone through this experience of seeing the genuine evil throughout the world, and they had, before the war, they had seen the experience of people who said, "Oh, let's not get involved over there. That's none of our business." Mm-hmm. And the consequence of that was the Holocaust. And so they came out of World War II with the idea that there are such things as universal human rights, and that the peace and security and very survival of the human race depended on the embrace of broadly liberal values. Now, they tended to be welfare statists, so they were not like libertarians or anything, but they were...
And very quickly, because I suspect the word liberal will come up a lot in this conversation. Are you using it as the term classical liberal, or are you using it in a more modern context, or is it kind of...
It's a little bit of both, because libertarians are a species of liberal in the sense that the primary political good is the liberation of the individual, and so liberals, the modern liberal, shares that goal, but just thinks the best way to accomplish that is with the welfare state, and the libertarian shares that goal, but thinks that free markets are the best way to do that.
Okay.
So the Star Trek stands in the tradition of liberalism broadly understood, and Roddenberry had certain socialist leanings. And there are some writers for the original series who were socialists and so forth, but they all sort of had this idea that planning and technological progress would liberate individuals to make the most of themselves.
Okay, and we can contrast them with, say, you use the phrase "the new left," and I've heard that before, and that's a reference to Picard and the incoming Next Generation crew. What is the new left?
Well, the New Left comes about in the late 60s, largely in reaction against things like the Vietnam War. And the New Left rejects technocracy and scientific and technological progress in preference for a critique of modern civilization that prioritizes primitivism or ecological protections, and they're opposed to the idea of technological advancement on the theory that it alienates us from nature.
Okay.
And the rivalry on the left in the 1960s between the old left of people like Lyndon Johnson and the new left, like people who rioted at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, that is really going on during Star Trek. And so you see that tension within Star Trek, mostly particularly in the episode with the space hippies, when the Enterprise encounters a group of futuristic hippies who have stolen a spaceship and are trying to find a legendary planet that they know of as Eden. And they persuade the crew to help them find Eden. And sure enough, they arrive on the planet Eden, and they get off the spaceship, and it turns out every plant on the planet is poisonous with acid and kills them all. And the legend here is the anti-utopian nature of Star Trek. It's really an older liberalism of the LBJ variety and opposed to this new hippie liberalism.
Right, and Kirk would just despise any of that, right? Kirk is openly contemptful and disdainful of what he views as passivity in humanoids. If you are willfully disavowing yourself of sort of creative progress to go backwards or to embrace some sort of utopian thing, he thinks that's a sham. And if
that's
not open,
a very important part of what Star Trek is about. Gene Roddenberry has this vision that the quintessential quality that makes humans great is their striving to discover strange new worlds, to invent, to maximize themselves, that internal struggle. And Kirk has contempt for species that don't try to do that and have no interest in doing that or are satisfied with illusions. And he also believes that every sentient race has a right to freedom, and is therefore he's opposed to things oppressive regimes on planets that he encounters where the races are prohibited, whatever the alien race is prohibited from exploring or expanding or discovering.
And I think he encounters both, right? Because the two that stand out in my mind, and I'll preface this, I was born in '84, so I did not grow up with the original series. It was already well established by the time I came in. TNG was going on. I kind of grew up paying attention to Deep Space Nine, and then have gone back and started watching the original series, which I think is basically the Twilight Zone in space, and it's phenomenal because it's portrayed. It's funny when you look back at clips. People love taking the kind of cornball looking stuff. They like the Gorn fight and things, and they like focusing on the cornball thing for the time that it was operating in, where all of the other ships are rockets with flames shooting out of the back on strings, and they're fighting guys in aluminum foil suits. It was pretty cool, and I'd say from a philosophical standpoint, it's really just as fascinating and enveloping as the Twilight Zone is.
That's a connection that is very important to understand Star Trek, and a lot of people miss it, is that Star Trek, first of all, it was the first television show that was not an anthology science fiction series. It was the first science fiction series.
What does that mean? Does that mean where they're switching every episode to a different cast? Okay.
Like Twilight Zone does, where every episode is a different thing. Star Trek was the first to have a series of continuing characters in the science fiction world. Star Trek and Lost in Space that came out at the same time. And the vision behind Star Trek was this Twilight Zone kind of idea, or predating Twilight Zone, the radio series X-1. That whole genre of each episode being a thought-provoking sort of investigation into some philosophical conundrum, as opposed to the sort of soap opera approach that later Star Trek gets into, where it's all just about the characters and that sort of thing. That was very central. And Roddenberry actually, he had in mind Gulliver's Travels. That was the model on which he based Star Trek, was that this crew would go around and encounter something that would allow them, the writers, the opportunity to comment on social or philosophical problems.
Yeah, so one of the a good friend of mine, Jennings, his critique of Roddenberry, who he would give due deference to were he here. One of his critiques of Roddenberry is that Roddenberry seems so opposed to ever portraying human foibles on the crew of the Enterprise, and that for that reason the Enterprise always had to be going to another planet that had problems in order to engage in any type of conflict, because he couldn't abide conflict on the Enterprise itself.
Yes, that is true, and that's actually explored in some detail in a documentary you can get on Netflix about the writing of The Next Generation and how difficult they found Roddenberry to deal with in that regard. And Roddenberry was a quirky guy. He had some nutty ideas. He was a better writer than people give him credit for, but he was a bit of a kook in some ways. But what's essential are the qualities of freedom and scientific progress and striving and discovery and an inquiry into what it means to be human. One thing that I like to say about Star Trek is the point of Star Trek is that Spock is wrong. We idolize Spock and we love Spock as a character so much that it's easy for us to overlook the fact that the reason Spock exists in the series is to show that he is wrong about how he approaches life. And what the Star Trek 2, 3, and 4 movies, what those accomplish is to give you that message in full. 2 is a great movie, and everybody says it rightly that it's the best of the Star Trek movies. But they sort of forget that 2, 3, and 4 make a trilogy that shows Spock evolving from someone who is rigidly logical and adheres to the idea that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. In Star Trek 3, everything reverses that, and the crew give up everything in order to save Spock. And if you think about what happens by the end of Star Trek 3, Captain Kirk has lost everything that matters to him in the world. He's lost his ship, he's lost his family, he's lost his best friend. And when Spock asks him, why did you do all of this? Kirk's answer at the very end of the movie is, because the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many. And that paradox represents how Spock is evolving into a human being over the course of these films, so that by Star Trek 4, when the crew is faced with the need to rescue Chekhov, who's been injured, and Spock says, yes, we must rescue Chekhov, Kirk turns to him and he says, is that the logical thing to do? And Spock says, no, but it is the human thing to do. And so the climax of 2, 3, and 4 is that Spock has finally at last just become a human being. And he's done so by overcoming logic. And that's sort of the last point on that. The period on the end of that sentence is in Star Trek 6, when Spock says, logic is the beginning of wisdom and not the end. He's become a human being.
I was about to say, there's definitely that foil in Star Trek 6 between him and the other Vulcan, where she's still, I guess, logical, but at the same time, she's also a traitor and an assassin, among other things. Which is another question I have for you. It is my understanding that Gene Roddenberry tried and failed to change the undiscovered country. And I've listened to previous podcasts you've done, and I get the impression that you also are no fan of the undiscovered country. And I wanted to ask you about that.
6 is a bad movie for all sorts of different reasons. It's beautiful to look at, and I remember when it came out.
I got to say, it's a one. I will say that it's. You get the impression of the bigness of everything in it. I feel like it's good about setting the tone. But I also think it's a really cool film just for kind of exploring the conclusion of the Cold War, because it more or less coincides with the fall of the Soviet Union, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that was what they were aiming at. The problem is that it gets it exactly backwards as a moral matter.
Okay.
The Klingons, who in this movie are representing the Soviets, and often in the original series were representing the Soviets. The Klingons are made out in Star Trek 6 to be the victims of Federation aggressiveness, which is absurd. We know from the entire show that it's the Klingons who are the aggressive, oppressors and murderers of the peaceful peoples of the galaxy, and that the Federation is basically the only institution that stands between the Klingon Empire and the domination and enslavement of the entire galaxy.
Which they're doing throughout the original series. They're endeavoring to commit genocide a couple of times, and the trouble with Tribbles, which is this fun romp of an episode, they're also trying to poison a planet's food supply. They are very much a heartless evil empire. But Star Trek 6, though, I don't get the impression that it's portraying the Federation as bad. I think the Klingons say that. Like, they go to dinner and they talk about the word inalienable rights is inherently racist. But that's coming from the Klingons themselves, right?
That is, but we never are given any kind of refutation of that. And on the contrary, the climax of the film occurs in the prison when Captain Kirk says to Dr. McCoy that he was wrong all along to distrust the Klingons, and that the Federation has become obsolete and so forth. And at the very end of the movie, when Kirk has prevented the disaster from occurring at the peace conference, the Klingon woman says to him, "You have redeemed my father's faith," which is insane. Kirk has no obligation whatsoever to redeem her father's faith. It's the Klingons who owe the peaceful peoples of the galaxy an apology, which they refuse to give. In fact, as it were, the Klingon woman says during her great speech at the conference, "We are a proud people, and we intend to go on being proud." proud of what? A record of enslaving and oppressing the peoples of the galaxy. The Klingons at no time either apologize or are asked to apologize for decades, if not centuries, of aggressive imperialism throughout Star Trek. So the good guys are made out to be the bad guys, and Captain Kirk is essentially made to apologize for the Federation's position as the peacekeeper and protector of freedom throughout the galaxy. Now, it's the whole film, and aside from that, there's all sorts of technical problems with the film that the canon is messed with. Klingon blood suddenly is this other color that it's never been before.
You'll enjoy this.
Again,
it's pink because if they'd made it red, it would have been rated R. So there's actually a little bit of government censorship at work. Or actually, I don't know whether the MPA is a government or private organization, but they had to make it pink, that kind of Pepto-Bismol color.
They use it in order as a plot point too, because that's the color of the blood on the boots that and even though the Klingons' blood goes back to being red throughout the rest of the series, and there's all sorts of other little problems like that just don't make any sense. So Star Trek VI, it's a beautiful film to look at, and the music is great, and one thing that the director Nick Meyer is really good at is giving you that feeling like you're really on a spaceship and stuff. But it's just a lousy movie.
I will respectfully disagree. I think it's a great film, and I want to add to your critique of it a little bit, because it sounds like you're coming at the Undiscovered Country with what sounds to me like a very deontological and very Kantian approach of, justice be done though all the world burns. And it seems to me that the Undiscovered Country is a consequentialist film, where it's not necessarily saying that the Klingons are good or that everybody's right and special in their own way. It's basically saying we just have to move on from this conflict.
Well, if that's the case, then it demonstrates the problems with consequentialism quite eloquently, in that by failing to even ask the Klingons to apologize, the Klingons continue, as we know from The Next Generation, to be an aggressive, warrior, imperialist race that has no respect for individual rights. And we found out in The Next Generation that the peace treaty that was signed at the Khitomer Conference turned out not to work after all, and the Klingon Federation alliance has been tentative from the very beginning. Had they begun with a clear statement of the principles of justice, perhaps things would have turned out differently.
I would, if I could go back and make you an ambassador at the Khitomer Accords, I absolutely would, Tim. And I'll add to that, I think that the Next Generation's take on Klingons and Klingons thereafter is very different, because in Star Trek, the original series, Klingons are the bad guys, and it's not an ethnic thing. They don't even look really that different. They just have like funny eyebrows. And then in Star Trek, the Next Generation, they cease being a proxy for the Soviet Union, and they basically become a thought experiment of what would a civilization composed entirely of 16-year-old boys look like. Because all of the Klingon speeches are really just like, I will fight you, honor is important to me, and it changes. But I do think it's interesting you bring that up, because there is this sea shift between the two series. You've got Captain Kirk, who beams down to planets and goes, your God is a lie. We're going to destroy your God. It's all wrong. And then you get Captain Picard, who comes in and goes, we would never look poorly at another civilization's way of looking at things. The diversity of the universe is important. And they have this very, very different take. And we go from this Cold War cowboy Captain Kirk with a very clear right and wrong to Captain Picard. And I've done more to prepare for this interview, by the way, Tim, consciously and over the last 20 years than probably any one college assignment I ever had, including my senior thesis. So I was going through these kind of different TNG episodes versus TOS episodes. And Picard does have a very different way of dealing with things. He is a relativist, and he uses the prime directive Kirk basically views the prime directive as like sort of a coaster. Like it's just this kind of thing that, yeah, okay, we've got it, but if you really need to violate it, you should. Picard uses it more frequently, but I look at it and he kind of uses it as a moral excuse not to engage. Where he'll bring up the prime directive. There's a great episode where symbiosis, where there's two civilizations, two different planets with a different species, and the one has addicted the other one to a drug, and they've deluded them into thinking that it is a cure for a disease that they have, which they don't. And Picard, as I recall, struggles with whether or not to deal with this issue, and ultimately he decides that he's not going to force the bad guys to do anything, but he's also not going to repair their ship, as he said he would. So it's this kind of dealing with inaction through further inaction and using it as a tool. But it's I don't feel like Kirk would do that. Kirk would just like disable their ship and then frog march them all in front of the council of the other planet to acknowledge their dastardly doings.
Yeah, so the difference between the Next Generation and the original series is not abrupt. It's a gradual thing. And when you watch especially the opening seasons of the Next Generation, it still has that original series quality to it. And it's only over the course of the series that it becomes more and more relativistic and gets farther and farther away from what Star Trek was really about. I would object a little bit to the reference to Kirk as a cowboy.
Okay.
A much better analogy would be to Captain James Cook, the great explorer of the 18th century, who is really the predecessor of James Kirk. James Cook engaged in these very famous 3 expeditions in which he discovered much of the South Pacific. And in each of these encounters, this was the age of the Enlightenment. He was not trying to conquer these peoples as the conquistadors had done, but rather to meet them and add to science, and perhaps in some cases to alleviate their condition in their primitive states. And that's more what Kirk is trying to do. And the reason that the Prime Directive is introduced into the series is as a foil. The whole point of the Prime Directive is that the Prime Directive is supposed to be broken. The Prime Directive is the very evil at which the original series authors were aiming their guns. The idea that in the moment of when you see somebody being oppressed and raped and beaten and murdered and robbed, that you should stand back and do nothing about it. That's what the Prime Directive says. And so Kirk routinely breaks the Prime Directive because the whole point of Star Trek is that the Prime Directive is bunk. And it's only over the course of the Next Generation that it gets elevated into this sort of unquestioned dogma. But when you think about what the Prime Directive actually says, that you should never interfere in another civilization, even when those people are being oppressed and deprived of their natural, inalienable human rights, it's intentional moral blindness and therefore wrong. And Abraham Lincoln, during his debates with Stephen Douglas, Abraham Lincoln said that Douglas's idea that he didn't care whether slavery was approved or disapproved by the voters was the same kind of moral blindness. Lincoln said that was the idea that if one man wishes to enslave another, no third man should be allowed to object. That's what the Prime Directive is. The Prime Directive says, let things burn. And Captain Kirk is right to refuse to allow things to burn. Now, it is true that interference in foreign cultures can cause all sorts of terrible things. For example, Captain Cook, when he discovered the Polynesians, very often his crew spread to them terrible diseases that caused all sorts of problems. And Star Trek is conscious of that fact, of course. But as a moral matter, when the Prime Directive is relevant in Star Trek is in episodes like The Apple, which I take to be the quintessential episode of the original series.
And the Apple, to set it, the Apple is where they find Vol. I think that's the right one? Because there's a couple episodes where they go back and they find these sort of backslid cultures. But Vol is this sort of serpentine robot that is controlling the species. They can't have sex. But they don't know or care. They're living in this sort of Edenic state, but they're also living in this Edenic state in total and complete unquestioned servitude to this robot snake, which sounds terrible when I'm describing it.
No, that's right. And it is, in some ways, it has all the corniness that people like to make fun of about Star Trek in the makeup and the special effects and things. But the message of this episode, and you're right, it's very similar to some other episodes, particularly The Return of the Archons is another episode that's almost identical.
Both of which involve Kirk destroying a robot, because he goes back to the Enterprise and blows up their god.
Yeah, exactly right. And he's right to do it, because they are being oppressed and deprived of their freedom and their rights as thinking creatures, as sentient beings in this universe. And the doctrine of the Enlightenment, which Kirk represents, is that we should emerge from our self-imposed darkness, if you want me to be a Kantian for the show, and that we should discover the opportunities and the freedoms that reason entitles us to. So the reason it's called the Apple is because Kirk is essentially the serpent in the Garden of Eden in that episode, and we are told this from a humanist perspective, that it's a good thing that the Eve ate the apple so that her eyes were opened and she could be human rather than mere cattle. And the people on this planet are mere cattle until Kirk liberates them.
So if Kirk is the champion of the Enlightenment in the original series, is Picard then a devotee of Rousseau? Because
I think so. I think at least by the end of the series, yeah.
There's a in your essay you say I liked this. You were talking about the movie Insurrection, which I think is a wonderful contrast to the episodes you just mentioned, Return of the Archons and The Apple, and you say of Picard, civilization was not the perfection of nature or even a protection against nature, but an alienation from nature, which sounds very Rousseau to me.
Yeah, very much so. That movie in particular is a betrayal of everything Star Trek was taken to stand for. In that episode, it begins with Picard saying, "Gosh, I wish we could be out there exploring again, but instead nowadays all we do is these boring diplomatic missions." And then over the course of the movie, they discover these people who have apparently been technologically advanced at one point in their past, but then decided that they didn't like that and have gone back to raking leaves by hand.
Mm-hmm.
And
playing hacky sack. There's a good hacky sack scene in that movie.
Oh my goodness! And I'm sure that they have wonderful barn raisings like the Amish, but that's exactly what this species is like. And Kirk would have had nothing but revulsion had he encountered them. But Picard, it's quite the opposite. Picard says, "Oh well, we could learn a lot from the race
the Baku, yeah."
He says we could learn a lot from the Baku. Well, no, actually, they could not learn anything from the Baku. What the Baku have done is a fundamental betrayal of what it means to be a thinking creature, which is to challenge oneself and expand one's horizons and learn things that are learnable and discover and be who you can be. And it stands in contrast to everything Star Trek had previously stood for. And the reason why is because of the rise of moral and cultural relativism, particularly in the late 60s, and the dominance of the new left intellectually that overthrew the old left technologically advanced technocratic ideas of people like Gene Roddenberry.
So you're coming out of a classical liberal, and actually I want to back up very quickly just because I mentioned Rousseau. So we've got in the Enlightenment tradition, we've got John Stuart Mill, we've got Locke, we've got Hobbes. Rousseau is in this kind of other camp. He's representing this sort of postmodern emotional response to civilization and the idea that civilization itself is this bad thing that separates us from a kind of Edenic primordial state, and that we should go backwards to that. He also believed in the perfectibility of man and just kind of the idea that we are blank slates. We could, if you designed the right system and you had the right leader like Napoleon, who came in and implemented it, then we could elevate everybody to a level of happiness and goodness. And he sort of rejects the idea that there are lurking selfish attitudes in the human nature, which other classical liberals tend to put front and center in terms of designing systems.
Selfishness is taught to us by civilization,
right.
He says.
It's not inherent.
And so he's the patron saint of hippies. And the reason why is because the fundamental philosophical difference between Rousseauian Romanticism and the Enlightenment theories that had preceded him, people like Thomas Jefferson and so forth, is that for the Enlightenment, civilization protects us against nature.
Right.
And for the Romantics, civilization alienates us from nature. And that's the crucial difference. That's why the Romantics idealize primitive cultures and in Rousseau's phrase, the noble savage and so forth. And Star Trek, the original Star Trek, does none of that because it had seen enough. The authors of Star Trek had seen enough of genuine savagery between 1941 and 1945. But by the time the Next Generation comes along, or at least halfway through the Next Generation, you see a rise of this appreciation of anti-civilization values that climaxes in Picard saying, "Oh well, if only we could be primitive also."
So Tim, you're coming out of a classical liberal philosophical bent, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, but it sounds to me like you're egging for a John McCain to take over the Federation when you're discussing this. That you're contemptful of this kind of non-intervention principle that's embodied in the Next Generation, but that tends to be something that goes hand in hand with classical liberalism and libertarianism in the United States, right? This idea that the foreign policy should be very restrained, that we shouldn't go around slaying monsters, we shouldn't, couldn't go around nation building. But how do you rectify those two things?
Oh, I just think it's a terrible weakness within the libertarian community. No, I don't pretend to toe the line of any political party myself.
Yeah.
No, you're right to cite McCain. McCain it's an interesting example to use because, of course, Star Trek was on the air during Vietnam, and there are episodes that make specific reference to Vietnam, particularly an episode called A Private Little War, where Kirk actually goes out of his way to defend the idea of balance of power, of arming both sides of this primitive society that is being warred upon, attacked by the Klingon Empire. So this was the original series was written from the Lyndon Johnson old left perspective that was pro-American involvement in Vietnam. It was fundamentally anti-communist.
Right, or Kennedy for that matter. Kennedy was a liberal, but was a emphatically anti-communist liberal, and should be noted was shot by a communist for his involvement in Cuba.
And his inaugural address is, I mean, you read that thing and it could have been said by James Kirk himself.
Yeah.
Whereas by the time you get to Next Generation, you have the Vietnam experience under our belt, and we approach these questions from a very different perspective. And I don't want it. I know that this comes off as me taking sides, one side versus the other. I don't want it to be that way, because I think that obviously Vietnam showed the weaknesses of that post-World War II liberal consensus, and showed that we, just as a practical matter, don't have the wherewithal to free the peoples of the world from dictatorships everywhere. And that's a valid critique of that, and Star Trek, when it engages in that critique, obviously is valid to do so. My complaint against later episodes is because I think they really betray what's central to Star Trek. But that doesn't mean that every episode, by any means, is entirely wrong in their critique of this.
No, and they're still doing cool things. I mean, you still have exploration of what it is to be human. I mean, I think Data's a wonderful character. I still really like Picard. I absolutely enjoyed Jean-Luc Picard and Patrick Stewart's portrayal of him. I can't wait to see what he's going to do, bringing that character back.
Oh, I can.
Oh, yeah. I was when I found out about that,
Trek.
Tim, I was like, because you read the press release that Patrick Stewart had about bringing Jean-Luc Picard back, and it's like, in these troubled times, we need a leader people could. And I was like, wait a minute, is he doing this because of Trump? Because if he's bringing Picard back because of Trump, that should have been part of the Trump campaign. If I get elected, I will force Patrick Stewart to bring back Jean-Luc Picard. And I would have been like, oh man, okay,
yeah,
he's got the Federalist Society picking his judges, and he's got Jean-Luc Picard. That seems like a pretty good deal.
If only there was a list of Star Trek actors that we could return to the same way there is the list of judges that he's going to appoint.
So to go back briefly, because I do think Insurrection that we touched on a moment ago is a very good contrast to the two episodes you brought up, the Return to the Archons and the Apple. If Kirk were to beam down there and I were with him and he were just and I agree with you, he would be absolutely sneering at what he would view as sort of a spiritual sloth that had overcome these people. But if you said, like, look, they're trying to focus more on relationships than gadgets, they're trying to live in the moment, is that antithetical to the Star Trek ethos?
I don't think so. No, in fact, Kirk himself, I think, on occasion does just that and recognizes that the need for that sort of thing. But I think it's the elusive quality, the fakeness of utopianism per se that Kirk would understand. There's a great scene in the first Next Generation movie, Generations, when it turns out that Captain Kirk has been sucked into this sort of vortex where he's been existing for all this time in this world of illusion, and he doesn't realize it until Picard arrives and tells him, guess what? It turns out all of this is an illusion. And now the tables are turned, right? Picard is the apple in Captain Kirk's Eden. Mm-hmm. And he says, it turns out all this is fake. And that instantaneously, that is enough for Captain Kirk to give it all up. Here he is, he's living in happiness on his horse ranch.
He's cooking eggs for his girlfriend and hanging out with his dog, and
and yet he's still wearing a Starfleet uniform. I mean, he's happy as a clam, and all of a sudden when he discovers it's not real, snap, he's done with it. He has no interest.
He jumps over the ditch, or he rides his horse over a ditch several times. And
instantaneously,
and then realizes that there's no actual threat there, and that because of that he has no desire to do it. He wants to make a difference. He
says, "But it's not real," which is one of the best lines in Star Trek, and that is the opposite of what happens in Insurrection. In that movie, the very fact that it's not real is taken to be sufficient for us to think it's a great thing.
Yeah, Insurrection has lots of problems with it. That's probably one of my least favorite films.
Kirk has this clear-eyed moral judgment that makes him a really great character. I think, nowadays, like you said, it's fun to caricature Star Trek, and one way that's done is that Captain Kirk is just this kind of idiot ladies' man.
Yeah, he's portrayed as a playboy, but when you watch the original series, it's like he flirts a little bit, and then he goes and does his job.
And he's very intelligent and highly educated.
And very competent.
He was a walking stack of books in the academy, we're told.
Yeah.
He quotes John Masefield and John Milton by memory, and D.H. Lawrence. I mean, he's a highly educated and intelligent man.
I think I'll retract my earlier statement calling him a cowboy. When I watched the original series, I think he's almost more like an old-style Roman proconsul or governor, because he's going out into space and has incredible latitude. Like he captures Khan, which is something we should talk about in a moment because there's now two Khans. He captures Khan, who is, we're to understand, something akin to somewhere between Napoleon and Hitler. He is a eugenics boosted, genetically engineered Superman who tried to take over the world, and is fled. And Kirk has found him, and I find it very interesting that Kirk can just drop him off on a. He ultimately takes over the ship. Kirk beats him, and he takes him and the other Supermen who are guilty of all of these atrocious war crimes and drops him off on a planet, which I don't think you could do.
Thing.
And I'm like, he doesn't need to call Starfleet or anything and tell them that he found this guy. He's not going to go on trial. He just drops him off, and then he comes back in the Wrath of Khan.
This is one of the things that I think this is a great episode because he doesn't kill or imprison Khan. Instead, he gives Khan a planet to be on and to rule over and to make a new civilization. And the reason why is because, as you say, Khan is the Nazi Superman who actually is a Superman, who really does have all of the gifts that the Nazis just claimed that they had, right? Mm-hmm. And so this puts Kirk in kind of a conundrum. This Khan, it really does exist on a plane above us, Kirk says. And would it be right to punish him for that?
He openly admires him. There's this interesting conversation between Kirk and Spock where they kind of reverse roles, because generally
that's right.
Spock is generally a little bit more emotionally removed from what we would view as baddies. He'll kind of, like when they go down to the Apple, he views the relationship between the helots, these slaves living there, and the robot as just an interesting situation that we should document, whereas Kirk is like, no, we're going to destroy it. But when it comes to Khan, Kirk, I think he says something to the effect of we can condemn someone while still admiring them.
Yeah.
Right. And sort of looks at it, I think, the way a lot of people would view Napoleon, as a very impressive tyrant. He's impressive. He is nonetheless a tyrant. And Spock takes the kind of moral position that, nonetheless, these people abrogated liberty and squashed, human freedom and that sort of thing.
That's exactly right. And so Kirk's solution to the problem is not to enslave or imprison Khan, but to give him an opportunity to prove his gifts, which in Kirk's way of thinking is the best possible reward that he could have, right? So it's a really that's why the episode's called Space Seed, is because Khan is a seed that from which a new future is to be born. So it's an interestingly complicated way of meditating on the question of, so you've got this civilization in which all men are created equal. What do you do if you encounter people who actually aren't equal, who really are superior to you? Is that blameworthy? Not necessarily, but it does mean that they cannot exist in our world. And what would make an interesting contrast to that is the classic John Wayne Western, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. In that film, John Wayne represents this sort of old-style cowboy who there's no place for him in the civilized society. And so when the statehood comes and when civilization comes, John Wayne has to kind of ride off into the sunset. He becomes sort of this legendary figure because there's no place for the civilization that he has been the indispensable man in founding. And so it's sort of a similar tone in Space Seed there also, where Khan his strengths are valuable, and if you just have to find a way of harnessing them in a way that's compatible with peace and justice.
But later, Khan comes back. He comes back in Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan. Some sort of event ruins the planet that he was building this fledgling, Superman civilization on. His wife, who was one of Kirk's crewmen, who went with him voluntarily, she died, and he's just been brewing in discontent, and he ultimately tries to take over the Enterprise again, and we can assume once he kills Kirk, would have tried to take over the Federation. And Kirk, of course, is able to fight him off and destroy him. But we see in the reboot with J.J. Abrams a different Khan, played by Cumberbatch, and we see a different take on Khan. And it was going back to your original essay, it seems that you're kind of, there's almost like a plummet for you, Tim, as you're looking at Star Trek. It starts with this sort of pristine morality of right and wrong and going through space, exploring and also fighting totalitarianism, to this next phase of, Rousseau commanding the Enterprise as Picard and this sort of moral relativism prevaricating, and then it just completely drops off with J.J. Abrams, where there's not even a pretense of morality behind it. It's just, flashy lights and nothing else. And I guess in reading a couple of other essays, it seems that the major critique of that from a moral standpoint is that there's no reason to actually dislike Khan in the new version. Mm-hmm. In the old version, Khan was basically saying, from what we can tell, the old version Khan is saying, look, I am a superior human being, therefore I should be able to rule over other people, and is contrasting this sort of meritocracy or egalitarian element present with Kirk. In the new one, it's just sort of, well, Kirk's our guy and Khan's the other guy, so we're rooting for Kirk because he's on our team.
That's exactly right. And so the JJ, now take this, to begin with, JJ Abrams films are so stupid that they don't really withstand the kind of intellectual analysis that we've been doing here about.
Yeah, I will say I enjoyed. I think it's just called Star Trek, right? Whatever the reboot is. I enjoyed it. I thought it was going to be just a lot of people in bikinis, like trying to milk Star Trek for a few more viewers. I enjoyed that film. I didn't like how they made emo Spock. I think they've betrayed the basic fundamental nature of Spock by making him weepy all the time. I didn't like that. But otherwise, I enjoyed the film. But he makes he is not sitting down and reading Kant and Rousseau in preparation for this.
Or Star Trek. J.J. Abrams has made no secret of the fact that he doesn't like Star Trek, and so it's no surprise he produces bad stuff. But let's do it anyway. Let's compare the new Khan movie with the old stuff. In the new version, we are given no reason to praise Kirk and condemn Khan. Quite the opposite, really, if anything, because Khan really is superior, we're told, and we're given no reason to think that Kirk is anything better than that. The only thing that we're given is at the very end of the movie, he gives this weird speech where he says, sometimes when terrible things happen to us, we're tempted to retaliate and get revenge. This is what Kirk says. But that's not who we are. That's it. That's the entire extent of his explanation of why he's the good guy and Khan's the bad guy. Well, yeah, okay, it's not who we are, but Khan is the better guy, as we all concede. So therefore, shouldn't we be him instead of Kirk? Logically speaking, it makes no sense. In fact, if anything, it's just sort of an appeal to the kind of tribalism that you were talking about earlier, that it turns into an us versus them mentality, and which betrays Star Trek again, because the idea that somebody is just inherently destined to rule because that's our tribe versus their tribe is just the sort of evil that the original Star Trek aimed to
which is one of the lines that kind of not scares me but addles me from Spock in the later films. Young Spock talks to emo Spock talks to old Spock and asks him for advice, and old Spock tells him that Kirk has to rule because that's just the way it is. Right. And I think that the basic the default state of human beings is tribalism and strongman. Right. And I'm bothered by both the sort of very small, minor, but nonetheless their appeal to this is just our group identity, and that's another group, therefore that's it. You don't need any further explanation. I'm further bothered by the idea. There are a lot of Star Trek does not do this. There are episodes that deal with the transfer of power. We see that with the Klingons and things like that. We don't see that within the Federation, but there are these other films where, like Game of Thrones, where there's this high importance on who's the legitimate king. And I enjoy all those films, but I look at that and I'm like, well, that's nonsense. There's no such thing as a legitimate king. There's no magic that animates who inherits the crown and that kind of thing. And I'm bothered by the backslide into that.
And that's the way the original Star Trek would have gone too.
I agree. I don't think that they would have ever. Kirk would never have said, oh well, because you inherited the crown, therefore it has. So I want to jump over J.J. Abrams for a second. We've got these sort of stand-ins for these various political blocks of thinking. We've got the Cold Warriors in the original Star Trek. We've got the '80s relativists. What about we also have post 9/11 where we're living now. Does the Enterprise, the Enterprise series, or Discovery or Voyager mark any type of different moral shift in Star Trek thinking?
I think a little bit. The original or the show Enterprise, which was on for 4 years and starred Scott Bakula, I actually really enjoyed a lot. I think it's a very good show. It's a show for people who really loved the original series, though, and so as a result, I think it had limited appeal to the audience. But they do try to deal with September 11th in that show because that was on the air at the time. Mm-hmm. And they I don't think they do a very good job of it, but they introduce a lot of sophisticated political complications with the plots, and I think they do manage that quite well. The Vulcans are made out, for instance, to be a lot less sympathetic than they were in the original series.
Oh yeah, that is a wonderful thing about this series. I haven't actually finished that series because it never gripped me, but I did enjoy the just dripping condescension, because the Vulcans are sort of in the previous series they're the sages of the set, whereas in this one they're just very, very British. They are the
yes.
They're the incredibly snotty, we're just inherently better than you whippersnappers civilization, and you even get these kind of whiffs of like, what are they up to? What are they plotting? Because there are a couple of times where they're just outright lying because it's pre-Federation.
Rich, and I thought that was handled pretty well.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that part. There's some of those things and also like Deep Space Nine. We haven't talked much about that.
Yeah.
I think Deep Space Nine is a fantastic series. The only reason I don't really talk about it a lot when I talk about Star Trek is because I think it's so different from everything else in the Star Trek universe that it hardly qualifies as Star Trek. They're not going anywhere. They're not exploring strange new worlds. It's very well written sometimes. It's just a different animal.
No, I agree. Although I do love Deep Space Nine, and I see it as kind of a precursor to Battlestar Galactica, which I'm sure will make another great episode of or segment of alienating the audience.
What a terrible show that was! God, what
I will fight you in a pub, Tim. I love Battlestar Galactica,
and I'll beat you. So
and Deep Space Nine I think is very similar to that because Deep Space Nine is a political soap opera in the last 4 seasons of it. And my favorite episode of Star Trek is in Deep Space Nine. It's in the Pale Moonlight, which is this.
Mine too.
It's a wonderful episode where they're sort of wrestling between does the ends justify the means. It has a great Garrick episode. Garrick's one of my favorite characters. So we're going to wrap it up here in a couple of minutes, Tim. I'll open up one last can of worms that is a departure from the philosophical outlook we have of this, but I just kind of want your view on it. There's a lot of back and forth on message boards and in pub conversations about Star Trek. Is the Federation socialist?
Well, yeah, I think it sort of is, at least at the beginning. Roddenberry, he just wasn't I don't think, a very sophisticated economic thinker, and I don't.
No, there's a lot of inconsistencies where sometimes there are credits. There's an episode early on where I was watching the original series a few months ago where they have these asteroid miners. That are they're
cloud miners.
They're ore miners or something, and they're living on this desolate planet, just this horrible hellscape of a world because it's really, really wealthy, and they appear to be from America or from somewhere on Earth, and they're out doing this, and these women come and they're desperate to get married. And they go live, and I'm watching this going, wait a minute. So there's no dating apps in the Federation. These women have to go to the edge of the galaxy to get married, and the Star Trek universe kind of goes back and forth on the economics of it, and it's never very clear what's happening.
And on the social critique. In the episode The Cloud Minders, which has a group of miners living underground and then very wealthy people who live in these very tall cities that are up in the clouds, Kirk basically engages in what you would say is a socialist revolution on this planet by forcing the people who live in the high cities to come down and work in the mines. And you could see that as a socialist critique of capitalism even. So yeah, I think
or the Ferengi for that matter, who I think are a pretty big rebuke to the idea of commerce. I mean, they're portrayed as greedy and evil, and there's lots of screams
Well, I used to think that they were a caricature of capitalism until Donald Trump was elected president, and I realized that the caricature has some basis in fact.
A civilization of Trumps. Ugh.
It turned out, yeah, exactly. It turned out that you really can't write a TV show in a genuine socialist utopia because then there's no scarcity and there's no money and there's no who knows what any of that nonsense would mean. And so they had to reintroduce money and commerce with Deep Space Nine and gold press latinum and all that sort of thing. So, it really isn't a socialist show in that sense. But I think that the post-World War II liberalism that they were coming from in the original series does kind of tend in the direction of socialism, or at least managed capitalism. And I think the show found that just as unworkable as real life would.
Yeah, I think the Federation's basically a gigantic European Union because they're still like, the Vulcans have ambassadors and things, so it's not like a unitary state.
No, definitely not.
Well,
and there is a lot of commerce going on. I mean, there's characters like Cyrano Jones who sells the tribbles in that episode. He travels around selling things, and we see occasionally these characters who just travel around selling things in almost sort of a Star Wars quality. They're merchant sailors and all that sort of thing. And that kind of fades away in Next Generation, but that's present in Star Trek.
Definitely, yeah. It's definitely there in the beginning. It comes back in Deep Space Nine. And one explanation that I've read about, I've not read the entirety of the book, but I read part of a book called The Economics of Star Trek, which is fascinating. Because the premise to that is that, as I understand it, Star Trek or the Federation is neither capitalist nor socialist, but is living in a post-scarcity economy. Because they have replicators, they have so your material goods are all taken care of. You can have them replicated instantaneously. Energy is no longer an issue. There's abundant energy available for everyone. The only stuff that you actually need to really find things for is starships, but on an individual consumer level, everything is free and abundant. There's nothing that's scarce. However, even in that world, there would still be things that you couldn't replicate, which are things that have emotional value. So, for example, if I wanted to get wine, not replicated, but I wanted wine from Picard vineyards, there's only so much wine that they can make per year. Or if I want to get food from Ben Sisko's dad's restaurant in New Orleans, or maybe it's a New Orleans-themed one in San Francisco, I can't remember, there's nonetheless a limited amount of table seating available there. So there would be some kind of almost like Etsy-style gift economy, where I'm going to make things that have emotional value, and we're going to have some kind of swap system there. But that's getting into a whole other field. I will save that for, as I said, another episode of Alienating the Audience. So, Tim, I'm just going to toss a couple of very quick geek-out nerddom questions to you, then we'll finish up. If you were going to be the captain of a starship, which one would you want, and what model?
Oh, I love the Excelsior.
I do too. I would. That's the Excelsior. I think is the most. It is the Chrysler building of Starfleet vessels. They
ruined it with the Enterprise B. This stupid thing with the stupid wings things, whatever that is on the bottom. That looks dumb. No, the original Excelsior.
Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, and what would you name it if you're captain of it?
Oh gosh, Excalibur.
Ooh, nice. I think we've been talking politics. I want to name it the Goldwater. Probably because you're from the Goldwater Institute. That's in the back of my mind. Maybe I'd make it the Lock, the HMS Lock, and then
the USS James Kirk.
Excuse me, the USS. Yeah, the USS Kirk's pretty good. I do plan to name my future son Kirk Heaton. So you've further entrenched that.
Boy, that's a Scottish name. Woo.
Kirk Heaton sounds like he might run for Parliament. And
he sounds like a county.
God willing, he will. Tim, I have enjoyed the hell out of talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for going deep down the rabbit hole on the underlying philosophy of Star Trek. I could not have enjoyed that more. And come on again to talk about other stuff. You're a fascinating guy. I would love to talk to you about your book, Frederick Douglass.
Well, we'll have to have a showdown about Battlestar Galactica at some point.
You know what? We might well. I get pretty good feedback from listeners, and it might be that they just say don't even talk about politics, just argue about sci-fi. And we might just have that where you and I just get into a bare knuckle argument about why I think Battlestar Galactica is the greatest television series there's ever been, including Breaking Bad and everything else. But Tim,
hang your head in shame.